Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them takes us deep into the historic campus of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, a place known for its serene gardens, winding paths, and sprawling academic halls. But at night, when the crowds have thinned and the quiet settles over the campus, something far stranger begins to stir. In tonight's episode, we focus on a tale that has haunted students for decades. It is said that long ago, in the 1,960 seconds, a young woman from mainland China met a tragic fate near the train tracks that border the campus. Locals whisper that her spirit never left. She walks the path where her life ended, her single braid swaying unnaturally in the night air, her face blank as if erased from memory. Those who have crossed her path describe an icy chill that crawls down the spine and the unsettling sensation of being silently watched. No one knows exactly when she will appear, and the few brave enough to venture alone along the tracks after dark often find themselves wondering whether the stories are warnings or something far more real. In the heart of Hong Kong, the Chinese university sits quietly, its sprawling campus perched on the slopes of the hills that divide the city. During the day, students rush between lecture halls, their voices mingling with the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of trees swaying in the wind. But when the sun sets and the last of the classes are dismissed, a different kind of presence seems to settle over the campus. Shadows stretch long across the pathways, and the usual chatter fades into an eerie, almost tangible silence. It is in this hushed atmosphere that the story of the Braided Girl begins to take shape. Decades ago, a young woman from mainland China had dreams of reaching Hong Kong, of starting a new life beyond the borders that had confined her. She was small, quiet, and determined, with a single braid trailing down her back, swaying as she hurried along the train platform. That night, she had snuck onto a train, hoping to make her way undetected, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. As the train neared the area that would later become the university campus, she attempted to disembark, eager to step onto the streets that promised freedom and opportunity. But tragedy struck in a single, horrific moment. Her long braid became entangled in the moving wheels, pulling her into an end that no one could have predicted. From that night onward, the campus carried a story that students would whisper to each other, especially those who dared to walk alone near the train tracks after dark. Some say the air feels heavier along that path, colder, almost as if the very space remembers what happened. It is here, in this setting of quiet tension, that new students and visitors feel an inexplicable unease. The paths are lined with trees that seem to lean closer as one walks by, and the distant sound of the city fades into something almost imperceptible footsteps that are not theirs, or the faintest brush of movement in the shadows. The campus, which appears calm and serene in daylight, transforms at night into a place where fear lingers just out of sight. Tonight, the main character is not someone from the present day, but the ghost who haunts this space, the Braided Girl herself. She retraces her final steps, her presence almost imperceptible, until it is too late. Students who wander the tracks report seeing her moving silently, her face blank, her braid swaying unnaturally, and a cold chill that seems to seep into the very bones. The goal of anyone near that path is simple: to pass safely without drawing her attention. Yet, curiosity has a way of luring even the most cautious forward, and the question that lingers is whether some things can ever truly remain unseen, or if the campus itself will reveal its darkest secrets to those who venture too close. As the story of the Braided Girl continued to circulate among students, a sense of unease began to build, subtle at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was not the kind of fear that comes from a clear threat, but something more elusive, a feeling that something unseen was watching from the edges of vision. One evening, a new student named Ming decided to take a shortcut along the train tracks, unaware of the stories that had long circulated among the older students. He had heard the warnings, of course, but youthful skepticism and a sense of invincibility led him to believe the tales were exaggerated. The path was quiet, the city lights barely reaching this corner of the campus. As Ming walked, the crunch of gravel under his shoes seemed unnaturally loud, echoing across the empty space. Every so often, a gust of wind rustled through the trees lining the tracks, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was difficult to place a low, dragging noise, or perhaps the soft swish of something brushing against the ground. Ming stopped, listening carefully, but the sound faded before he could identify it. He pressed on, trying to shake off the growing sense of tension that had begun to coil in his chest. That was when he noticed it. A single braid lying across the path, seemingly dropped in the middle of nowhere. It looked fresh, almost as if it had been placed there moments before. Ming bent down to examine it, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The braid was unnaturally stiff, its dark strands glinting in the pale moonlight, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He quickly straightened, telling himself it must have been a trick of the light, or perhaps a prank left by another student. But then something even stranger occurred. As he continued walking, he could feel a presence following him. At first, it was subtle, a shadow moving just beyond his peripheral vision, a whisper of movement that disappeared whenever he turned his head. Ming stopped again, his heartbeat quickening. The tracks ahead were empty, yet the sensation of being watched intensified. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, pressing down on him as though the night itself had leaned in closer. He considered turning back, but curiosity gnawed at him, a stubborn insistence that kept his feet moving forward. That was when he saw her, though, not clearly. A girl standing by the side of the tracks, her figure pale and thin, her single braid trailing down her back. Her face, from the angle he glimpsed, appeared to be missing entirely, a smooth, featureless void. Ming froze, unsure if he was seeing a trick of the shadows or something far more unsettling. The girl did not move toward him, nor did she retreat. She simply stood there, motionless, as if observing him, waiting for him to make the next move. A chill swept over him, far colder than the night air could justify. He could feel it in his bones, the same icy grip that countless students had described in hushed whispers. The hairs on the back of his neck rose, and for a moment he debated running, but a strange compulsion held him rooted in place. Then, as abruptly as she had appeared, the figure shifted slightly, her braid swaying unnaturally, curling and twisting in a way that no human could control. The sound was subtle but unmistakable, a dragging, scraping noise that followed each movement, echoing across the stillness. Ming turned and hurried back the way he had come, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. Had he really seen her, or had his imagination been caught in the tales he had dismissed for so long? Yet the braid, lying in the middle of the path where he had stopped to examine it, remained. It was a stark reminder that the strange presence was not a trick or a figment of youthful overconfidence. Something lingered here, something tied to a story that had ended decades ago, a story that refused to be forgotten. The first complication had arrived. The haunting was not distant. It was here, and it could be felt in every step along the tracks, waiting silently for the next unwary passerby. As the nights grew longer and the campus settled into its quiet, eerie rhythm, more reports began to surface among students. Whispers of the Braided Girl were no longer limited to hushed stories passed along in dormitories or over late-night noodles in the cafeteria. Those who walked the tracks after dark spoke of additional oddities, details that made the first sighting seem almost mundane in comparison. Ming, still shaken from his encounter, found himself drawn back to the campus despite the warnings, unable to resist the lure of understanding what he had glimpsed. On one particular evening, he met a fellow student named Li, an older, wiry boy with sharp eyes and an almost unnatural calmness. Li warned him immediately. "Do not go near the tracks alone," he said, his voice low and tense. "I've seen her before. Not the braid, not just the figure, but the emptiness in her face. It follows you, always watching. You think you're alone, but you're never alone there." His words, though cautious, carried an urgency that made Ming's stomach tighten. Determined to confront the growing mystery, Ming ventured closer to the spot where he had first seen the braid. This time, the air was heavier, pressing in around him, filled with the faint metallic tang of iron from the tracks. Shadows moved in ways that made no sense, twisting and elongating as if they had minds of their own. It was then that the second strange event occurred. A low, scraping sound began behind him, soft at first, almost like fingernails dragging across stone. He turned sharply, but no one was there, just the empty path stretching ahead, and the dark silhouettes of the trees swaying in the wind. Li's warning echoed in his mind. But there was more. On a small, forgotten signpost near the tracks, Ming noticed words scratched deeply into the wood. They were old, faded, almost impossible to read, yet the meaning was chilling. "Stay away when alone. Those who see her do not walk away unchanged." The message seemed to pulse with the same icy cold that had gripped him before, a warning carved decades ago that still carried weight tonight. As Ming stepped closer, the braid from before appeared again, lying across the path as if inviting him forward. But this time, the motion was different. The strands lifted slightly, swaying unnaturally, defying any breeze. The shadows seemed to converge, and the oppressive silence thickened, making it impossible to distinguish sound from imagination. Every instinct told him to flee, but another part of him, a dark curiosity, pushed him forward. The tension stacked with every step. The presence of the Braided Girl was no longer a distant story. It was immediate, layered, and unpredictable. The warnings, the whispers, the inexplicable movements, they all converged to form a web of dread that made Ming question reality itself. The campus, once a place of study and ordinary life, had transformed into something alive with memory and loss, a place where the past refused to remain buried, and where the first encounter was only the beginning of a series of unsettling truths that seemed determined to reveal themselves, piece by piece. Ming's curiosity had long since overpowered his fear, and that night he found himself walking the tracks once more. The moon hung low over the campus, casting pale light on the twisted shadows of the trees and the glint of the steel rails. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself resisted his movement. The silence was thick, almost tangible, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hum of the city that felt impossibly far away. Then he saw her. The Braided Girl appeared on the tracks ahead, motionless, her pale figure glowing faintly in the moonlight. Her single braid hung down, swaying slightly, though the air was still. Ming froze, unable to look away. Her face was blank, an emptiness where features should have been, yet he felt her gaze, a weightless, inescapable pressure that seemed to pierce directly into his mind. A cold chill washed over him, and every nerve in his body screamed to flee, but his feet stayed rooted. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, her braid began to lift, curling and twisting in ways that no human muscle could manage. It moved almost of its own accord, like a living extension of her presence. Ming instinctively stepped back, but the braid seemed to follow, swaying closer, brushing the tips of his shoes. The shadows around him deepened, warping into shapes that were not there moments before, and the night air grew heavy, almost suffocating, pressing in from all sides. A sudden sound, barely more than a whisper, cut through the quiet. It was the scraping of the braid against the tracks, the faintest metallic hiss that seemed impossibly close. Ming spun, expecting to see someone else, but the path behind him was empty. He realized then that the entire world around him had shifted. The trees, the tracks, the signposts, everything seemed slightly off, as though he had stepped into a memory rather than reality. Then, the unimaginable happened. The braided girl stepped forward, but her motion was unnatural, almost jerky, as if she existed between two planes at once. The emptiness of her face felt alive now, pulling at him with a silent demand, and Ming felt the world tilt. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, and a cold, invisible weight pressed against his chest. Every instinct screamed danger, yet the fear was mingled with a strange, inexplicable sorrow. Ming took a cautious step back, and the braid twitched, again curling toward him like a dark tendril. He realized in that instant that this was not a ghost meant to harm in the conventional sense. This was a spirit caught between life and death, bound to the tracks where her own life had ended. The chill that surrounded him was not just cold, it was grief, longing, and despair, radiating outward like a pulse from her very being. Ming's perspective shifted entirely. The campus, the night, even the story he had dismissed as myth, now felt alive with memories he could almost see, hear, and feel pressing against him with unbearable weight. The braided girl lingered for a moment longer, her braids swaying, her blank face fixed in a silent plea. Then she vanished as abruptly as she had appeared, leaving behind only the faint trace of cold air and the echo of her presence. Ming stood on the tracks, trembling, utterly aware that the story he thought he understood was only the beginning of a reality far stranger and far more unsettling than he could have ever imagined. After the braided girl vanished, Ming stumbled back to the edge of the campus, his mind racing and his body trembling. The air still felt charged, as if the night itself had witnessed what had just occurred, and the silence around him was no longer peaceful, but heavy with expectation. He could still feel the lingering presence, a cold weight pressing at the edges of his thoughts, reminding him that the story he had dismissed as folklore was not only real but far more complex than he had imagined. Desperate for answers, Ming sought out Li, hoping the older student might shed some light on the events. Li listened intently as Ming recounted everything: the braid lying on the tracks, the twisting movement, the blank face, and the suffocating cold that seemed to radiate from her. Li's expression was grave, and he nodded slowly, confirming that what Ming had seen matched the accounts of others who had walked the tracks at night. "It is her," Li said quietly. "The braided girl. She is trapped between life and death, bound to the place where she died. Her story is old, but the energy she carries has not faded. That path is a threshold, a place where the living and the dead brush against each other. Some see her and turn away, some are drawn closer, and some are followed, even when they leave." His voice carried a weight that made Ming realize this was not just superstition. Li explained that the braid, the blank face, and the chilling presence were not mere tricks of the mind. They were remnants of the trauma that had ended her life in such a sudden, violent way. Ming began to understand that the strange events, the whispers in the wind, the shifting shadows, the inexplicable movements were all extensions of her unfinished story. The braid that seemed to move on its own was a symbol of the moment she died, caught in machinery she could not escape. The blankness of her face was not emptiness, but a manifestation of a life abruptly erased, a soul suspended in limbo. Li offered a warning. The girl did not appear to harm, at least not in the conventional sense. She was a presence of mourning and loss, a tragic echo that replayed the final steps of her life. Those who walked the tracks alone might feel watched, chilled, or unsettled, but the deeper danger lay in failing to recognize her story, to pass by without understanding that this was more than a ghost story. Ming left with a new perspective. The braided girl was no longer simply a terrifying apparition. She was a lingering memory, a silent witness to a tragedy that demanded acknowledgement. The fear he had felt was real, but it was intertwined with something far more profound. A sorrow that refused to be ignored, a past that reached across decades, and a lesson that some places remember in ways the living can scarcely comprehend. Ming walked away from the tracks that night, his legs unsteady and his heart still hammering in his chest. The campus was quiet, the shadows stretching long and unnatural under the pale glow of the moon. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the braided girl silently following, her blank face fixed on him, her braids swaying with every step. But the path behind him remained empty, leaving only the echo of what he had witnessed. He reached the dormitories, his breaths shallow and rapid, trying to convince himself that leaving the tracks meant leaving her presence behind. Yet, even inside the warmth and light of his room, the chill lingered. The sense of being watched, of being traced by something unseen, had not faded. Ming could not shake the feeling that the braided girl's story was not yet complete, that her unfinished journey had somehow entwined with his own. Later, as he recounted the night's events to Li in hushed whispers, they both fell silent. Somewhere deep in the distance, the faintest sound reached them, a dragging, scraping noise, soft but unmistakable, as if someone or something was walking along the tracks, replaying the tragedy again. Ming swallowed hard, realizing that the girl's presence might extend beyond the stories and the warnings, waiting for the next person who dared to walk her path alone. And then it hit him, a question he could not answer. If she only appears to those who are alone, then why had he felt her near him, even when Li had been by his side? The answer was nowhere in sight, and the truth remained locked in shadows. Some mysteries, it seemed, refused to be solved, lingering like the cold on the tracks, waiting silently for the next footsteps to echo along the night. Just as the Chinese university campus holds the chilling presence of the braided girl, other universities across Asia have their own restless spirits. Not far from Hong Kong, in a Malaysian university, students have reported encounters that are equally unsettling. In a quiet recording studio, late at night, a group of students struggled to complete their work, only to discover that the room itself seemed to resist them. After finally finishing a take, a haunting female voice emerged from the speakers, singing a Japanese tune none of them had ever heard. Even after leaving, the melody returned unexpectedly, playing from a powered-off laptop. These stories remind us that academic halls and quiet campuses can hide memories of tragedy, where spirits linger, longing to be seen, heard, and never forgotten. It was late evening at the Malaysian University, and the campus had emptied for the night, leaving only the hum of distant streetlights and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside the recording studio, a small group of students huddled around microphones, headphones, and mixing equipment. Their goal was simple: to finish a project that had been delayed for weeks, a series of recordings that were meant to capture their final compositions for the semester. They joked among themselves, trying to shake off the creeping unease that seemed to settle in as the hallways grew quieter and darker. The studio itself was tucked into a corner of the building, with thick walls meant to contain sound but somehow amplifying the feeling of isolation. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, flickering once or twice, and the air felt unnaturally cold despite the humid night outside. Each student moved with careful precision, setting up instruments and adjusting levels, but even the familiar sounds of their own voices and the keys of the keyboard seemed to carry an echo that didn't quite belong. One of the students, Ina, was the most focused of the group. She adjusted the microphone stand and checked the recording software, trying to push aside the sense of being watched. Her friends laughed nervously when she jumped at small noises, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the studio had a presence beyond their understanding. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the ventilation system, felt like it carried intent. They began recording, and at first, everything seemed normal. The instruments hummed, the voices blended, and the digital meters danced in sync with their performance. But with each take, subtle interruptions began to creep in. A misplaced note, a sudden hiss in the background, sounds that weren't part of the music. They paused repeatedly, checking equipment, blaming tiredness or electrical interference, yet the disturbances persisted. The tension in the room grew, thickening the air, making each shadow in the corners of the studio feel sharper, darker, alive. By the time they prepared for their final take, the students were both exhausted and apprehensive. Their goal now was not only to finish the recording, but to survive the night in a place that seemed to have its own rhythm, its own will. The air felt heavier, and the silence between notes was charged, pregnant with something unseen. In this studio, the boundary between music and the supernatural seemed to blur, and every keystroke, every breath, carried the possibility of summoning something that had been trapped here long before any of them arrived. The group had just started their first take when the first sign that something was not right became apparent. Aina, seated at the keyboard, pressed a chord, and the sound came out crisp and clear, yet a faint echo lingered behind it, almost like a whisper layered underneath the note. She paused, frowning at the monitor. "Did anyone else hear that?" she asked, but her friends shook their heads. "It's probably just the software," one of them said, forcing a laugh. But the unease had already begun to creep into the room, settling into the corners and filling the air with a quiet tension that none of them could shake. As they continued, minor anomalies kept appearing. The recording would suddenly drop a second of sound here or there, or a quiet, unidentifiable hum would rise in the background. At first, they chalked it up to technical glitches, faulty cables, or tired ears. Yet the pattern grew too consistent to dismiss. The hum, the glitches, even the soft, almost melodic swish that seemed to follow the rhythm of their music. It was as if the room itself was participating, listening, correcting. Each time they stopped to check their equipment, everything appeared normal, perfectly functional, yet the disturbances resumed the moment they played again. Ina grew increasingly nervous. Her fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant, as if expecting something to respond before she struck the notes. Shadows cast by the studio equipment seemed to stretch longer than possible, and in the reflection of the soundboard glass, she thought she glimpsed a figure, pale and still, standing behind her friends. When she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, telling herself it was a trick of light, a reflection warped by the angle of the glass, but the prickling feeling along her spine refused to fade. Then the first unmistakably strange event occurred. During one take, as the group finally hit a seamless run of their song, a new sound layered itself over the recording, a soft, haunting female voice singing a tune that none of them recognized. It was melodic, old, and carried a resonance that seemed almost mournful. Everyone froze. The voice did not belong to any of them. They glanced around the studio, half expecting one of their classmates to be playing a prank, but the room was empty except for their group. The equipment had not been tampered with, the microphones were secure, and yet the voice continued, subtle but clear, threading itself through the finished take. Questions raced through their minds. Who could be here? How was this possible? The voice had the quality of a recording, but no one had recorded it. No one had even sung that song in decades. Ana's hands trembled slightly over the keyboard, and one of the students suggested they stop and leave. The others hesitated, pulled by a mixture of fear and disbelief. Could it be interference from another studio? A leftover track somehow embedded in the software? The logical explanations began to crumble under the weight of what they had just heard. By the end of the night, the students completed a technically perfect take, but none of them felt triumphant. The recording was flawless, yet the mysterious voice haunted them, threading through their achievement like a shadow they could not dispel. They left the studio with unease pressing down on their shoulders, the soft, foreign melody lingering in their minds. The first complication had arrived. Something in the studio was aware of them, interacting with their work in ways that were impossible to explain, a presence that refused to remain invisible and hinted that their night of creation was far from ordinary. The following night, the students returned to the studio, driven by a mix of obligation and unease. The previous night's recording had been technically flawless, yet the haunting voice replayed in their minds, refusing to let them forget. As they set up microphones and instruments once again, the fluorescent lights buzzed more loudly than before, flickering in rapid, irregular intervals. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, and the air felt colder, heavier, pressing against their skin in a way that made each breath feel like inhaling frost. Ina tried to focus on her keyboard, but her fingers hesitated, unsure if she was striking notes or responding to some unseen presence. Her friend Daniel glanced toward the corner of the room, where the recording console reflected faint silhouettes. "Do you see that?" he whispered, voice tight. They all turned, but nothing was there. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, subtle but pervasive, like a weight pressing from just beyond perception. Then the second strange event occurred. As Daniel tested a microphone, a low, melodic hum began to rise, soft at first, almost imperceptible. It quickly developed into a distinct tune, a Japanese melody from decades past, carrying the same haunting quality as the voice in their previous recording. None of them recognized it, yet it was precise, almost deliberate, following the rhythm of their own work, as if mocking them. Ina froze mid-key, staring at the keyboard that produced no sound. The melody was coming from somewhere else, somewhere they could not see, yet it was undeniable. Tensions escalated further when a teaching assistant, Mr. Rahim, entered the studio unexpectedly. He was a practical man, well-versed in technical equipment, and usually calm under pressure. But tonight his expression froze in a mixture of fear and disbelief as he glanced at the recording monitors. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, almost too quickly. "This room, it's not just a studio. There's something trapped here. People have heard it before. Left alone, it lingers. Be careful." His warning was vague, almost cryptic, but it carried a weight that silenced the group instantly. Even after he left, the air seemed to thrum with invisible tension. The keyboards emitted faint clicks, despite being powered off. The microphones picked up soft, erratic noises, and the shadows along the walls seemed to stretch toward the students, curling around them like dark fingers. The presence was no longer subtle. It was persistent, testing their nerves, watching their reactions, interacting with their instruments in ways that defied logic. Every note they struck, every breath they took, seemed to provoke it further, pulling them deeper into a situation they could neither control nor fully understand. By the end of the night, the students were exhausted and frightened. They had completed another recording, yet the studio had not released them from its grip. The strange voice, the melody from nowhere, the warnings of Mr. Rahim all converged to create an atmosphere where nothing was certain. The escalation was undeniable. The room was alive with a presence that would not be ignored, and every layer of tension revealed just how little the students truly understood about the recording room wraith. By the third night, the students had returned to the studio with a sense of dread that weighed heavier than any fatigue. The air inside the room felt almost solid, charged with a presence they could not see but could no longer ignore. Ina adjusted her headphones nervously, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Every step, every sound seemed magnified, as though the walls themselves were listening. The familiar glow of the monitors now felt ominous, casting harsh shadows that flickered like restless specters. They began another take, determined to complete the project despite the mounting fear. The instruments hummed, the microphones picked up their voices, yet beneath it all, there was that unmistakable layer, the soft, haunting melody that had tormented them for nights. This time, it was louder, clearer, almost as if the spirit itself had decided to assert her presence. The tune wound around their own music, seamless yet impossible, an invisible accompaniment that neither composer nor player had orchestrated. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into intermittent darkness. In those brief moments, Aina swore she saw a figure standing near the back wall, a woman, pale and still, her long hair cascading down, her presence pressing against reality like a weight she could not lift. When the lights returned, she was gone, yet the feeling of being watched remained, more intense than ever. Every instinct screamed that they were not alone. Then came the peak of confrontation. The keyboards began to play on their own. Notes struck with perfect timing, matching the haunting melody, each key pressed as if guided by invisible fingers. The microphones picked up whispers, soft and fragmented, like words trapped in the space between centuries. Ina leaned in closer to the console, eyes wide, realizing that the room was not merely haunted. It was responding, interacting with them, replaying memories that no one living had created. The studio had become a conduit, a vessel for a presence bound by unfinished music, and for the first time, the students understood that they were participants in something far beyond the ordinary. As the melody intensified, so did the temperature drop. Cold air swirled around them, and the walls seemed to hum in resonance with the song. The haunting voice grew stronger, not malicious, but insistent, pressing for attention, demanding recognition. Ina's perspective shifted entirely. This was no prank, no technical malfunction. The spirit was trapped, lingering in the studio, longing to finish her music, and they were caught in the fragile line between the living and the lost. Every sound, every movement, every shadow reinforced the reality of the wraith. By the end of the night, the students were trembling, breathless, yet fully aware that the studio had revealed its true nature. It was not just a room or a place to record, it was a space alive with memory, longing, and the unfinished notes of a life interrupted too soon. They had glimpsed the depth of its presence, and nothing would allow them to treat the recording studio the same way again. After the chaos of the third night, the students gathered outside the studio, shivering and unsettled. The lights of the campus seemed distant now, faint against the oppressive memory of what they had just experienced. Aina tried to make sense of it, but every rational explanation, the hum of equipment, software glitches, echoes in the walls, crumbled under the weight of what they had witnessed. The haunting melody, the self-playing keyboards, the whispers, they were no longer coincidences. Something far older, far more persistent, had claimed the space. Seeking answers, the students returned to Mr. Rahim, hoping the teaching assistant could provide some clarity. He listened carefully as they recounted the events, his expression grave, eyes darkening with a mixture of concern and recognition. "This is not new," he said quietly, almost reverently. "The studio, it holds more than just instruments and wires. Years ago, a woman spent her life here, dedicated to music she could never complete. She practiced, recorded, composed, and when her time ended abruptly, her presence never left. She is bound to this room, tied to the sound of her song. That melody you hear, it is hers, her unfinished work, echoing through the decades." Aina shivered, the truth settling over her like a cold hand. Every strange interruption, every anomaly, suddenly made sense. The glitches in the recording, the soft voice singing a Japanese tune, the keys that pressed themselves, they were not random. They were fragments of a life interrupted, a spirit struggling to complete what had been left behind. The room had been alive all along, responding to the student's presence as if seeking recognition, yearning for someone to witness her music and carry it forward. Mr. Rahim offered a warning that sent chills down their spines. "She does not wish harm," he explained, "but she cannot rest until her work is acknowledged. Those who enter alone may feel her presence more strongly, hear her song more clearly, and sometimes that can be overwhelming. It is a room of memory and longing, and it remembers every note played here." As the students absorbed his words, the studio no longer seemed merely haunted. It was a place suspended between time and memory, a vessel for a spirit bound to a melody that refused to end. The chilling voice, the unexpected music, the inexplicable movements, they were not tricks or malfunctions, but manifestations of her existence, persistent and insistent. For the first time they understood. The recording room wraith was not a malevolent force, but a lingering presence tied to unfinished dreams. Their fear shifted slightly, replaced with awe and sorrow. Yet even with this revelation, the full scope of her power remained unknown. The melody could appear anywhere, at any time, and the studio held secrets that no one had yet fully uncovered. The presence persisted, patient, waiting for the next note to be played, the next ear to listen. The students left the recording studio that night with a mixture of relief and unease. The hallway outside felt warmer, more ordinary, yet the weight of the presence inside clung to them, invisible but undeniable. Each step away from the studio seemed to pull at them, as if the walls themselves were reluctant to let them go. They dared not speak, each lost in their own thoughts, haunted by the melody that had followed them throughout the night. Aina glanced back once, half expecting to see a figure standing in the doorway, her braid of music lingering in the shadows. Nothing appeared, but the memory of the voice, soft and impossibly close, refused to fade. Even their laughter and chatter as they walked back to their dorms sounded hollow, overpowered by the echo of notes that were not theirs. Later, when they attempted to review the recordings at home, a familiar chill swept over the room. One by one, the haunting melody emerged from Ina's laptop, even though it had been powered off for hours. The soft, Japanese tune played again, perfectly clear, as if the wraith had followed them beyond the studio walls. Panic and fascination intertwined. Was the spirit bound only to the studio, Or had it attached itself to them? No one returned to the recording room after that night. Rumors spread among students. Some claimed they had heard faint whispers when passing by the building after dark. Others swore they could hear a piano playing softly through empty corridors. The melody remained, a reminder that the woman's unfinished music persisted, and that the studio, and perhaps even the students themselves, were now part of her lingering story. And one question remained, unanswered. If the wraith could follow a recording, could she follow a life? The thought lingered, cold and unsettling, long after the final note faded into silence. Just as university campuses in Hong Kong and Malaysia hold restless spirits, Bangkok too has its own haunting tales. Near Wat Samian Nari, locals whisper of two women dressed entirely in black, appearing silently in taxis late at night. Much like the Braided Girl or the recording room wraith, their presence is tied to tragedy long past. Some say the sisters died on nearby railway tracks, their spirits trapped in a loop of their final moments. Taxi drivers report sudden cold drafts and fleeting shadows in the back seat, an unsettling reminder that some tragedies leave echoes that refuse to fade. Across Asia, these stories reveal a common thread. Places touched by sorrow and death often harbor lingering presences, invisible yet profoundly felt, waiting for the living to witness what they cannot forget. It was late at night in Bangkok, and the streets near Wat Samian Nari were unusually quiet, the usual bustle of traffic and chatter reduced to distant echoes. The air hung heavy with humidity, carrying the faint scent of incense from the temple, and the occasional whiff of exhaust from passing motorbikes. In a taxi weaving through the dimly lit streets, two young travelers, Naran and Ploy, were making their way toward the temple. Their goal was simple, to reach the historic site and complete a project documenting local traditions. Yet the atmosphere around them was far from ordinary, the shadows cast by the streetlights stretching long and thin, twisting unnaturally along the pavement. The taxi hummed along the road, tires crunching over uneven asphalt, as the city's distant sounds faded into a heavy, almost tangible silence. Niran glanced at the rearview mirror and felt a sudden shiver crawl down his spine. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw movement in the back seat, but when he looked closer, the shadows were still. The sense of being watched was subtle at first, a prickling along the neck, a whisper of unease that seemed to come from nowhere. Ploy laughed nervously, brushing it off as imagination. Yet even she couldn't shake the feeling that the taxi was no longer empty. As they approached the temple, the streets grew narrower and darker, the lamp posts casting pools of light that seemed to avoid the corners of the road. The taxi's engine was the only sound, but beneath it, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur seemed to float through the air carried on the night. Every so often, the passengers caught glimpses of figures in the distance, two women dressed entirely in black, standing silently on the roadside before disappearing when approached. Despite the eerie sensations, the travelers pressed on, determined to reach their destination. The temple gates loomed ahead, bathed in shadow, promising the culmination of their project, yet exuding an intangible tension. The goal was simple: document and observe, but the air around Wat Samian Nari suggested that this was a place steeped in history and sorrow, where the ordinary boundaries of the living and the dead might blur. Every street corner, every flickering light hinted at the unseen, and the night seemed to thrum with stories that refused to be forgotten. Niran and Ploy could not know that their journey would bring them face to face with a legend that had haunted locals for decades, that the women in black were more than a story they were, a presence, waiting silently in the shadows, reliving moments of tragedy, and seeking something the living could scarcely comprehend. The night had only just begun. As the taxi wound its way closer to Wat, Sami, and Nari, Niran and Ploy could feel the tension in the air deepen, subtle but undeniable. The streets had grown almost deserted, the usual hum of the city replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional distant clatter of a motorbike or the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. Niran tried to focus on the streetlights ahead, but something about the shadows stretching along the pavement made him uneasy. It was then that he noticed them, two women, dressed entirely in black, standing silently on the side of the road. For a moment, they seemed no more than mannequins, frozen in place, but something about the way their figures swayed, almost imperceptibly, made his heart skip a beat. They didn't move toward the taxi, but the presence was impossible to ignore. Ploy leaned forward, squinting through the rain-specked window. "Do you see them?" she whispered, her voice tight. Niran nodded, swallowing hard, but when he looked again, the figures were gone. It was as if they had vanished into the night, leaving only the shadows and the faint echo of a presence that seemed to linger in the back seat of the taxi. The first strange event occurred a few minutes later. As the taxi slowed for a bend, Niran thought he felt a cold draft brush against the back of his neck, unnatural in the humid Bangkok night. He turned slightly, and for a fleeting instant, he could have sworn he saw movement in the back seat, a shadow flitting past, too fast and too deliberate to be explained by the streetlights. Ploy noticed it too, her eyes wide, but when they both glanced around, the taxi was empty. The sensation of being watched pressed in on them, subtle yet insistent, a quiet force that made their skin crawl. Niran's hand shook slightly on the seat, and he instinctively checked the rearview mirror again. That's when he saw it. The faint outline of one of the women, seated silently behind them. Her face was partially obscured, but her presence radiated an inexplicable dread. Before he could react, she was gone. The taxi felt smaller, the walls of the vehicle pressing closer as though alive, mirroring the fear in their hearts. Questions flooded their minds. Were these women real? Or was the oppressive night preying on their imagination? Could it be a prank, some local trick meant to scare tourists away from the temple? But deep down, they knew it was impossible. The temperature had dropped noticeably, their breath visible in the air, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. Something supernatural was at play, subtle yet undeniable, testing their nerves without offering any immediate danger. By the time they arrived at the temple gates, the sense of unease had thickened into a tangible weight. The women in black had appeared and vanished, leaving behind questions that could not easily be answered. The first complication had arrived. The travelers were no longer merely witnesses to a story. They were participants in a haunting, one that began with shadows, cold drafts, and fleeting glimpses, and promised far more than they could yet comprehend. After arriving near Wat, Sami, and Nari, Niran and Ploy hesitated at the entrance, the temple's ornate gates looming in the darkness. The streets behind them had emptied completely, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed against their ears. Every distant sound, a stray cat, the faint hum of a motorbike, the flutter of leaves felt amplified, almost deliberate, as if the night itself were holding its breath. The first encounter with the women in black had unsettled them, but now a deeper sense of dread began to coil in the pit of their stomachs, growing with each step closer to the temple. As they walked toward the temple grounds, the second strange event occurred. A sudden chill swept through the area, colder than the humid Bangkok air should have allowed. Niran shivered and rubbed his arms, and Ploy noticed the same icy sensation crawling along her skin. Then, from the corner of her eye, she glimpsed movement, a shadow gliding across the pavement, impossible to trace to any physical form. It moved with intent, weaving along the edges of the street, disappearing when she tried to focus on it directly. The sensation of being followed intensified, pressing against their awareness, subtle but relentless. Their growing anxiety drew the attention of a security guard who appeared at the far end of the temple path. Unlike the usual calm and courteous personnel, he reacted sharply to their presence, his expression tight with worry. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice low and urgent. "At night, it is not safe. Some things linger that do not belong to the living. If you value your safety, turn back now." His warning was cryptic, almost fearful, and yet carried undeniable weight. The students exchanged uneasy glances. The man's urgency confirmed what they already suspected. There was more to the area than mere superstition. As they proceeded, the shadows around them seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling along the edges of the walls and streetlights. Faint whispers brushed against their ears, fragmented and unintelligible, but unmistakable in their persistence. And then, from the corner of the street, the figures appeared again, 2 women in black, gliding silently toward them. Their movements were deliberate, yet unhurried, their presence radiating an almost tangible pressure that made every step feel heavier. By the time Niran and Ploy reached the temple gates, the layers of tension had stacked into a nearly unbearable weight. The initial encounter had been unnerving, but the cold drafts, the shadows, the fearful warning from the security guard, and the women's deliberate presence all combined into a crescendo of dread. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet the need to understand, to witness the truth of the legend, kept them rooted. The escalation was clear. The women in black were no longer distant stories or fleeting shadows. They were here, watching, guiding, and waiting, leaving the travelers to question what other secrets the night might reveal. As Niran and Ploy stepped onto the temple grounds, the night seemed to thicken around them. The intricate spires and shadowed corridors of Wat Sami Nari, normally a place of serenity, now felt alien, almost suffocating. Every step echoed unnaturally, as though the very stones were listening. The air was heavy with a strange chill that seemed to seep into their bones, carrying a faint metallic tang like iron or blood. The city beyond the gates had disappeared. It was as if they had crossed a threshold into a space ruled by something else entirely. Then, without warning, the women in black appeared before them again. This time, they were closer, moving with a grace that defied natural movement. Their long black robes swirled as if caught in an invisible wind, and their faces, pale and expressionless, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Niran froze, his mind racing to understand what he was seeing, while Ploy's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet their feet remained rooted, caught between fascination and terror. The peak confrontation began in earnest, when one of the women silently stepped into the space between them and the temple entrance. The air around her shimmered subtly, and a cold draft spiraled outward from her form, brushing against Niran's neck and sending chills down his spine. He could feel it in his chest, a pressure that made each heartbeat louder, each inhalation shallow. The shadows behind the figures began to twist unnaturally, stretching across the ground and curling around the walls, as though reality itself were bending to their presence. Suddenly, the women moved in a synchronized motion, gliding toward the edge of the railway tracks nearby. Ploy instinctively turned to follow them, and that's when the most disturbing revelation struck. Along the tracks, the shadows stretched and contorted, crawling like living shapes. It was as if the spirits were replaying their final moments, a silent, looping echo of tragedy. Niran felt an icy grip tighten in his chest. The women in black were not just apparitions, but remnants of lives abruptly ended, caught between this world and the next. The sensation of being watched intensified, surrounding them completely. The temperature dropped further, their breath visible in short, misty bursts. Whispers rose, fragmented and overlapping, carrying words they could not comprehend, yet filled with unmistakable longing and sorrow. It became clear. This confrontation was not meant to harm them, but to reveal the truth of the spirit's existence. By the end of the moment, Niran and Ploy's perspective had shifted entirely. The women in black were no longer simply frightening figures in a story, they were echoes of lives interrupted, their presence a testament to loss and unfinished business. The temple, the tracks, and even the city beyond had become a stage for memories that refused to fade. The peak of tension left them breathless, aware that what they had witnessed was only part of a much larger, sorrowful truth, and that the spirit's story was far from complete. As Niran and Ploy slowly backed away from the railway tracks, the shadows of the women in black seemed to linger just beyond sight, as if reluctant to let the living leave so soon. The chill in the air pressed in on them, but the terror that had gripped their hearts now began to mix with a dawning understanding. What they had witnessed was not random, nor was it meant merely to frighten. There was a reason the spirits appeared where they did, moving along the tracks, vanishing in taxis, and lingering near the temple gates. Seeking answers, they spoke to a local elder who had lived near Wat Samian Nari for decades. The man listened patiently as they described the women, the cold drafts, and the haunting echoes of movement across the railway tracks. His expression grew grave. "You saw them," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Those women, they were sisters. Many years ago, they died tragically on these tracks, and their spirits have not found peace. They move through the places they knew in life, repeating the last moments of their existence, searching for something that was taken from them too soon." The revelation reframed everything Niran and Ploy had experienced. The whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being followed. They were not tricks of the mind, nor random hauntings. The sisters were bound to the world of the living by the suddenness of their deaths and the incompleteness of their final journey. Their presence was mournful, insistent, a looping echo of a moment frozen in time. The taxis, the temple, the tracks, all were stages for the spirits' repeated attempts to reconcile with the lives they had lost. The elder warned them gently, almost mournfully, that the spirits did not wish to harm, but their sorrow and confusion could overwhelm those who came too close, especially at night and alone. "Respect them," he said, "and keep your distance. Watch, listen, and do not provoke. Their story is unfinished, and their longing is heavy. You may leave, but the memory will stay with you. The tracks in the temple remember, and some things never truly disappear." Niran and Ploy left the conversation with a new perspective. Fear still lingered, but it was tempered with sorrow and understanding. The women in black were not malevolent, but they were bound by a tragic past, caught between life and death. Their appearances, once inexplicable, now seemed purposeful, an echo of trauma and longing that had survived decades. And yet, even with this insight, questions remained. Could the spirits ever find peace? Would their presence continue to haunt the living indefinitely? The answers were beyond reach, leaving the travelers with both knowledge and an unsettling sense of incompletion. Niran and Ploy retraced their steps from the temple, moving quickly along the deserted streets, each footstep echoing unnaturally in the heavy night air. The women in black were nowhere in sight, yet the chill that had gripped them near the tracks clung stubbornly, wrapping around their limbs like icy fingers. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too far, every flicker of light hinting at movement that was not their own. The silence of Bangkok at night felt oppressive, almost sentient, as if the city itself was aware of what they had witnessed. When they finally reached a more populated street, Ploy dared a glance behind her. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw the faint silhouettes of the sisters standing near the temple gates, their black robes swaying unnaturally, unmoving yet undeniably present. Then they were gone, as if swallowed by the night itself. Niren's chest tightened with a sudden, inexplicable dread. Their story was far from over, and the sense of being watched refused to fade. Later, back in their dorm, the faintest echo of footsteps reached them through the walls, soft but deliberate. And then, from Ploy's phone, the low, whispering sound of a carriage wheel and distant, ghostly laughter, just for a moment, like the sisters had followed them home. Neither spoke, both frozen in disbelief, realizing that some presences cannot be escaped, and some stories refuse to end. And one question remained, lingering in the oppressive quiet. If the women in black could vanish so completely, yet leave traces behind, then how many times had they walked these streets unseen? And how many more would they walk, waiting for the living to cross their path again? The thought left a cold, unshakable knot in their stomachs, a reminder that some shadows never truly vanish. I hope you liked the stories so far. When I make these long videos, there are nights where I stay up really late working on them. If you'd like to sponsor my coffees for those nights, I'd really appreciate it. Of course, you don't have to. I truly enjoy making these videos for you. But if you'd like to, there's a link below the video. Oh, by the way, I wanted to let you know that tomorrow I'll be uploading a story about the darkest Asian horror stories that have never been discussed yet, but are true according to old Asian inhabitants. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it.